Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to RMIT University. We're in the former Magistrates Court under the very canopy where in 1880 Justice Redmond Barry sentenced to death a man who has gone on to become an Australian legend. And I speak, of course, about Ned Kelly. Welcome to the audience here in the court, at Federation Square on the big screen and on Channel 31. Kelly went to the gallows just around the corner at the old Melbourne jail. The jail and this building on the corner of Russell and Latrobe Streets form part of the National Trust's Justice Precinct. Now, Ned Kelly's corpse had scarcely settled in its grave when Melbourne philanthropist Francis Ormond made a public commitment to help fund what was called then a working man's college. That college, known today as RMIT University, opened here at Latrobe Street in 1887, less than 7 years after Ned Kelly was executed. Now, if the demise of the Kelly gang marked the end of Victoria's frontier period, the opening of the college could be said to herald a new era, an era of sober prosperity here for Melbourne, which raises the question that brings us here today. If Kelly had been caught, sentenced and then hung around 7 years later, would he actually have needed to have been executed? To put it another way, if the young Kelly had had the opportunity of an education at the Working Men's College, would his burning sense of injustice as well as his practical and political skills have been put to a different and better use? For Ned, was it a case of better read than dead? Today, this debate is being streamed live to Federation Square in simulcast on Channel 31. I'm John Faine from the ABC. I'm your host. Our panel members include Professor Verity Bergman, Australian historian from the University of Melbourne, Lex Lasry QC from the Melbourne Bar, Professor Margaret Gardner, AO from RMIT, where she's the University Vice-Chancellor and President, Simon Brown-Greaves, forensic psychologist, Dr Alan Montague, who at RMIT is an apprenticeships and training expert, Walid Ali, social commentator and author of a new book, People Like Us, John Rawlinson, CEO of Talent 2, a management consultancy and recruitment company, and Steve Dargaville, State Secretary of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. And I invite you, the audience, to be the judge. Would Ned Kelly have been hanged if instead he had been educated? Simon Brown-Greaves, you're one of Australia's leading forensic psychologists with a history of dealing with and profiling some of Australia's more interesting and troubled criminal minds. From what you know, what we all know of Ned Kelly and his background, give us a profiling, if you could, of the type of man that Ned was. Did this environment that he lived in contribute to his life of crime? Did he have a predisposition to murder and rob?
Thanks, John. Given what we know now and looking back and speculating as we must, Ned Kelly certainly appeared to be a man who was a product of his context, his environment and his time. And I have to say, in terms of the fundamental thesis, had he received a strong and solid education, would that have perhaps led to a different outcome? Absolutely.
Verity Bergman, how educated were people in those times?
Well, in 1861, only about half of school-aged children could read and write. In 1872, the situation started to improve when free, compulsory and secular education was introduced in Victoria. And over the next 3 years, 600 schools were built. However, by this time, poor Ned was 18. So he missed out on this very, very, very progressive development.
So to what extent was he just a product of his times?
He was very much a product of his times. He actually had several years' education. He passed reading and writing, but he failed arithmetic, grammar and geography. And if you read what Ned wrote, you can certainly see that he was not a role model when it comes to use of grammar and punctuation.
Although it raises the question whether Ned wrote what Ned is said to have written.
Oh, I think he did. It was transcribed by Joe Byrne, who was slightly better educated. But he was very, very much a product of his time in that he was one of the many people who were, after the gold rushes had ended, desperately needing to make a livelihood. And he was really a victim of what must be described as the biggest public policy stuff-up in Australian history, the Selection Acts. These were designed to settle people like Ned and his family on the land, to break up the monopoly of land held by the squatters. And in fact, they had exactly the opposite effect.
Yes.
Between 1860 and 1863, of the 1.8 million acres taken up for selection, 1.6 million went to squatters because they manipulated the system, they put up dummies, they basically got round the regulations.
A great land grab. Margaret Gardner, what does RMIT University offer that might have appealed to someone like Ned?
Well, what it offered then was quite a big choice of subjects, and a lot of people came to RMIT when it opened in 1887 to pick up the sort of education they had missed out on in earlier years. So although some people came at age 15, there were people who came who were much older, and they picked up the math, the algebra, the writing skills. In fact, a lot of the skills that then took them on to other qualifications. But he could have started in art. He could have started in architecture. He could have begun in metalworking. He could have begun in many things in 1887 at the Working Men's College.
And Lex Lasry, did he get a fair trial?
Well, John, that's been debated now for a long time, and of course for lawyers in the modern day looking at Ned Kelly's trial, the idea that a murder trial can be conducted in a day and a bit and be fair is almost beyond comprehension. And of course he was represented by a barrister who'd never done a criminal trial before, who was sent up here to get an adjournment so that someone with some experience could run the case for him. And of course Redmond Barry declined the adjournment and made the case run. No, it wasn't a fair trial.
Well, we'll see exactly whether or not the outcome could ever have been different as we resume our discussion about Ned Kelly. Better read than dead, and may education have made a difference to Ned Kelly on Channel 31 at Federation Square and here at the Melbourne Magistrates Court in just a moment.